Miss Diana is going to give us a little talk on Sears Town. So feel free to keep eating. Make s'mores. We have plenty of stuff over there for s'mores, okay?
And Margot asked me to tell you the story of how our neighborhood got started. Our neighborhood did get started because I said we have a story to tell. And most of the neighborhoods in Rock Island got started because they had a problem. We don't have a problem. We never did have a problem, but we have a story to tell. Margot gave me 15 minutes to give you the broad strokes. Anyway, if you would like to do the longer version of what I'm going to tell you, you can go down to the Rock Island County Historical Society and ask to see John Hauberg interviews with David Sears' son, David Jr. And they have got a big thick Sears, and you can read the whole thing about David Sears and how this area, what we call Black Hawk Park West, got started. So the quick version is this. It was begun by David Sears, and he is one of the founders of Moline, and also the founders of Black Hawk Park West. So anyway, he moved to Illinois as a young child with his parents, and they settled down in southern Illinois, down around Cairo, and this was after he lost several siblings in a boat trip, and they were on a boat, and they overturned, and two or three of his brothers and sisters drowned. And so after that happened, the family moved west here. He came from Cooperstown, New York, originally. And when he was 17, he went back east to get his education. And he's out here on the prairie. There's nothing down in southern Illinois, not a whole lot. He went back to the east, but he came back a year later with a wife, Melinda. And they stayed down in Shawneetown. He farmed for about 11 years. And he took his stuff down, his food down to New Orleans, came back up on the riverboat and all this. He did this for quite a while. Then in 1937, he moved to Moline, what is now downtown Moline. And together with three other guys named Spencer, Ainsworth, and White, these four men created a bridge. Not a bridge, but a dam, just an earthen dam with a brush and earthen dam across the Sylvan Slough, up at the east end of the arsenal, right there by where 15th Street goes down to meets the Mississippi. Right there was where they built this earthen dam. And with that dam, he was able to create water power for the city of Moline. Well, it wasn't the city of Moline yet, but the area right there around 15th Street in downtown, was now downtown Moline. So by the early 1940s, they were providing water power to the area. His goal was to provide water power to the entire area, and there were two. When they came around to naming Moline, which took place in about 1840, it was about 45 or so. When they came around to naming it, there were two names that were the top contenders for a name. The most popular one was called Hesperia, which meant Star of the West. Now, where's the star? Imagine this: if you take a line and draw it from West Rock Island all the way across to Silvis, it's a straight line. Now think of the rays coming out from that star. Here's your star. Okay, one ray goes to Rock Island, one ray goes to Moline, one to East Moline, one to Silvis, and one the other direction to Milan. These were the major hubs of the star. They wanted to call it Star of the West, Hesperia. However, the other group didn't like that name. They thought it was too highfalutin, too Greek, too, I don't know, just it didn't sit well with a lot of people or other people. And so they made a case for naming it after the French name, Moulin. Moulin means mill. And Moline, or the Moline area, because of this dam and the water power, David Sears built mills. Mill is another word for factory. So he was a mill builder. And so Moulin turned into Moline. Then by the mid to early late 1840s, David Sears and Charles Atkinson were the two people who platted the town of Moline. They laid out the streets. This would be downtown, what is now downtown Moline. It's right along the river there. But they were the two that platted Moline. And they provided water and water power to Moline. Now there were some, this Hesperia concept would have been a big super city. And it did, for people were not getting along with each other. Even back then, we had the definite Moline area and definite Rock Island people, and it didn't work out. But that they ever could have had a Hesperia or a Star of the West as one big super city. However, this water power that they did provide to Moline was the water power that they offered John Deere. And they gave him free water power for 5 years, kind of like our TIF, things now that we give to businesses to come here. So they offered him free water power, and he came, and of course his name superseded everybody else's. Atkinson did get a town named after him, a little east of here. But these other names, like Ainsworth and White, I'm not sure, but I think the Williams White building in downtown Moline on the one-way, that's probably is related to the White, but I'm not sure. Spencer was Judge Spencer, and his name runs through all the early history. But it's not, it's not seen on a street name, or a building, or a school, or anything like that. All the names got lost to John Deere. But anyway, these were the people that started these communities. Back at around this time, Rock Island was called Stevenson, which you probably have heard. But the name Rock Island was given to a paper town, also right here. And it stretched from here, 15th Street about, over to the river. And it was called Rock Island City, as opposed to Rock Island County, which was down in Stevenson. And, but anyway, it was a paper town. There were a lot of paper towns. Basically, a paper town was something that was laid out on paper and never materialized into a town. And so that's what happened with Rock Island City. It never became a city, but it was all laid out with streets names, on a map and all this, but it never became a town. It was placed on top of Saukenuk. And so Saukenuk also is down here. When we first started our neighborhood, there was a little debate about what we should call this our neighborhood. And there were 3 names that were going strong. It's sort of like the Hesperia deal. But the 3 names were Saukenuk, Sears Town, and Blackhawk Park West, or as somebody suggested, just name it by the location, because we kept calling it the area west of Blackhawk Park. We said, why don't you just call it Blackhawk Park West, or West Blackhawk Park? And so we voted on that. What happened was the 2 historical names got divided. The group that was voting were split between Saukenuk and Searstown, and therefore Blackhawk Park West won. And so that's how this got its name, but it's okay. It's a good name. Also, the name Rock Island also was the name given, that was the name that the island, Arsenal Island, was originally called Rock Island. Now, David Sears continues on the tip of Arsenal Island in Moline. And on the other side of that tip was a little island called Benham Island. It's now underwater, but it ran right next to the arsenal. He built another dam over there. And then he went out on the island, and he started building other factories, housing, and stuff like this, until he had almost a little community going out there on the tip of this island. At that time, that land really wasn't owned by anybody but the government. I don't think Davenport bought that. Davenport bought most of this land. George Davenport got most of this land for $1.25 an acre. But I don't think he had bought the arsenal land. And so basically it was just government land. And David Sears, along with others, went out there and were simply squatters. They built out, they lived on the land, they improved it. And this is the way things happened. And I believe it was like 1866 after the Civil War when they invented the Homestead Act, so that if you moved out to Nebraska or Wyoming in order to get people to move out there, they said, instead of just letting people go out there and squat, they encouraged them to go by saying, hey, we'll give you so many acres if you'll go out there for 5 years, live on this land, improve it, and to get people to move out there. That's what David Sears was doing, but at that time it wasn't legal. And so he was out there squatting on Arsenal Island, and during the Civil War, the government decided to make it into a Civil War camp, a prison camp, and then when the war was over, they thought, this would be a good place for an arsenal. But they had to get rid of David Sears and his buildings and stuff, so they bought him out. And they offered him $145,000 for him. Wow. He thought he should have gotten $185,000, but he took the $145,000 and ran. So here it is, the end of the Civil War, and he's got a pocket full of money. What does he do? He comes out here on the Rock River and buys land, our land, over here. He bought up this land, he built himself a town. And it wasn't really an official town yet. It didn't become a town until 1891, I think it was, or 92. They were building, the streets were here, he built the streets, he named them after his kids. There was George Street and William Street, and some other ones named after family members. He built himself a town. He served in the Civil War. He was an officer for the Union. I don't think he ever saw any battle, any actual fight. I think he was materials or something. I think he dealt with, supplies. But the man was 60 years old during the Civil War, But he felt like it was his duty to go to the war. His children ran the businesses while he was gone. And when he came back in 1860, he would have found things that when we moved here in '78 that were still here. Now there were some houses here in Searstown, but there were the remains of Saukenuk. There was the council house. I think was still here when we moved here, but I didn't know what it was at that time. I really wasn't interested in history. I never liked history until we moved over here, and I started reading my abstract, and started really liking what I was hearing or learning about this area. But the council house was torn down in, I don't know, probably in the 1980s or so. The platted forms for Rock Island City, which had been abandoned when Rock Island took over the name. He would have had those maps and everything, and he pretty much followed that. If he built these streets, he built them pretty much according to what the map had where they had it laid out. There were two houses built by William Dixon. William Dixon is the guy who founded Milan, and he had two houses. One is where Feaster's appliance place is now something else appliance. I forget what it's called. Ray's appliance, yeah. That would have been one of them. And the other one was, I think, the store with Blackhawk TV. And was it red brick or was it frame? I think it was brick.
Brick.
Was it brick?
It was frame.
Was it Frank?
Frame?
Yeah.
Well, then maybe the brick house went down or something, but it was it was next door. The two houses were next door to each other, and the way that it was described was a red brick house in that corner. And I'm pretty sure that was the other Dixon house. So anyway, he and his son David platted Searstown in 1869, and they built a flouring mill and a cotton mill down on the river, on the Rock River. The cotton mill is still there. It's called the Cotton Mill Apartments now. And his sons married, and they had families. They lived either in Milan or Moline, and quite often they moved them to Sears. And at that time, this was after the Civil War, and before 1980, he moved around the Midwest. And so he was responsible for all the way from Minnesota up here in Minneapolis, all the way down to Kansas, and some in Iowa and Nebraska, some too. He built water power, he built dams and mills, and he went around and he helped other small towns, get their start on, getting some industry going. And they came back here in 1980, and he built the house, which is now the caretaker's house for the park. And
You mean 1880?
1880, that's 1880, right. At that time, he was 76 years old, and he died in 1884 at his desk down in one of those mills down along the river. He was still working at age 80. Right next door to his house is Sarah McNamara's house, where she lives now, and that was where his son George, lived in that one. His son David Jr., lived at 4409 14th Street up here. And his son John, or David's son John, lived on 12th Street, right next to the Blackhawk Apartments, on that side, on the east side of the street. There's a little house there, I don't know if anybody's living in it, it was empty for a long time. But that house was owned by his grandson John, David's son John. Now, a couple of things that were happening at the same time that all this was happening here at Sears, with Searstown, has to do with Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb. He was born, believe it or not, I don't know quite what the coincidence was, in a town called Milan, Ohio. And it was pronounced Milan also. However, Milan was not originally Milan. Milan was originally Hampton, and Hampton was called Milan. How they got switched around, I don't know. But anyway, Edison was playing around with electricity, and he invented the light bulb in 1879. And also he invented a system of electricity distribution in 1880, a year later. And by 1887, there were 121 Edison power stations in the United States. Streetcars, now this is where this comes in. Streetcars were invented in 1866, right after the war. However, they were horse-drawn streetcars. There was no electricity yet. But by 1888, Grady Street had been electrified. So they had an electrical one moving up Grady Street Hill. In 1891, the Davenport electric company, or streetcar company, consolidated with the Illinois streetcar company. I think the ones that went, down there along the one-ways, would have been in that. There was one branch that I think went up to Prospect Park that was not part of this consolidation deal. But anyway, they had consolidated, so electricity was really becoming a big thing. That's important because, as you probably know, Black Hawk Park was an amusement park, and it was a destination point for the streetcar. Basically, they wanted to get these streetcars out there, wanted people to use them. They had to give them a place to go to. So it became an amusement park to draw people to have something to do. In 1892, 4 years later, Black Hawk Inn opened its first inn as a destination point for the streetcar to come out here. Sears, Illinois, as a town, was incorporated on May 3rd, 1894. There was a post office. In fact, I've got a picture of it. But the post office, the building at the post office is not here anymore. But this is what it looked like somewhere around. This is at the intersection of down there where 11th Street and 12th Street, where 12th Street veers off from 11th Street. That was the building that was sitting down there. So in 1896, this inn that they opened, 4 years later, it burned to the ground. And at this time, there was a battle between Sears, the town of Sears. Now, they battle between Sears, the town, and the streetcar company because Sears had annexed the park for taxes. They wanted the tax revenue to go to their city. They tried to compromise, they tried to license concessions. There was a war bill that levied a tax on bridges that they tried to get to help them get this tax money, but also the inn was rebuilt. And that summer was a very successful season for the Watchtower and the railway company. Fred Denkman became the vice president and director of the railway company that year. He was a local. You might have heard of Denkman Building, Denkman Library down on the channel. That's the Denkman. But he was the vice president. The other officers all came out of Chicago. A year later, the Tri-City streetcars were again under local control. So it was a good move. The consolidation between Davenport and Rock Island, except for the section of Moline, was finally accomplished. And then they had a problem in 1901 between, everybody got to ride the streetcar for 5 cents. Everybody but Sears residents. And for some reason, they were charged more. So they were trying to get the same 5-cent fare for their residents as for everybody else. But I guess it was cheap because they wanted to come out here to the park, to go to the amusement park, and the Sears residents could just walk over there. They didn't need the streetcar, and that's why they charged more. So what did the Sears people do? They tore up the track. They tore up 50 feet of track.
Oh my God!
Got sued $10,000 for it. Not a good idea. That was in 1901. Anyway, by 1915, Sears became part of Rock Island. And so the town of Sears just merged into Rock Island at that point. The streetcars were being replaced by buses, which could go, they were much more flexible. You could change the route very easily because they weren't dependent upon a track. By 1928, Watchtower Park had closed because by that time we had cars. The Model T had been, the Model A had been invented by that time. And so people had even more freedom to go where they wanted to go, and you didn't need a destination point to ride a streetcar to it anymore. So they closed the park. And in 1928, David Sears, Jr., along with John Hauberg, petitioned the state to turn this into a park like we have it now. And that finally was accomplished in 1935. So, but in 1937, 38, right after the park was completed, we have a member of our group right here who has lived here ever since 1937, and she'd like to tell you a few things about what it was like back here when she first came here.